As the battles of Smolensk and Uman neared their end, the Wehrmacht prepared for its third major offensive in the east. Army Group Center's panzers, once leading the assault on the Soviet Union, now shifted to a supporting role, tasked with securing Field Marshal Bock's flanks before aiding operations toward Leningrad and Kyiv. Last week we examined the plans for this renewed push and the struggle around Smolensk, where Timoshenko attempted to retake the city. This week we cover August 8th to 16th, as the fighting reaches a climax, and army groups north and south anxiously await reinforcements from Hot and Guderian. Previously we also discussed manpower reserves and how both sides managed replacements. Now we'll briefly explore the status of Allied aid, particularly from the US and UK, and clarify how military and economic assistance was handled in the West, an often misunderstood but critical part of the Eastern Front's wider context. Every week we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons: the Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job. The United States had legal limitations for aid in place that the United Kingdom did not. Today, the way to overcome these limitations is often referred to as Lend-Lease in short. However, Lend-Lease had grown out of the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s that had placed an arms embargo on the warring parties. It was amended to allow military equipment purchases on what was called a cash-and-carry basis. In 1941, the United Kingdom needed to continue to purchase military equipment and economic supplies, but was running low on gold reserves. In May of that year, the Act was amended to allow for military equipment to be transferred or sold to certain governments at the President's discretion. Vitally, this meant that payment was not required for the goods transferred. The Soviet Union was not initially covered under the Lend-Lease Act. This meant they could still order what they wished as long as they paid for it in gold or US dollars. Accordingly, in June and early July, they placed enormous orders with US industrial suppliers. The first order totaled close to $200 million US dollars, or 4 billion in today's US dollars. Thousands of planes, guns, trucks, and more were asked for. Furthermore, they requested raw materials, such as rubber, steel, aluminum, and oil. Sometime before the end of July, Stalin went to the extraordinary step of asking the American envoy, Harry Hopkins, to ask Roosevelt to join the war against Hitler. According to some sources, he offered that American troops should be deployed anywhere on the Eastern Front, under autonomous American commanders. This was similar to an offer Stalin made to Churchill around the same time. It illustrates the level of desperation the Soviet dictator must have been feeling as he watched the Red Army fall back from so many disasters during June and July. Nevertheless, these offers were refused. In Ukraine, Army Group South was attempting to steel itself for the offensive into the bend of the Dnieper River. However, the logistics situation was starting to appear grim. Many of Rundstedt's divisions in the leading edge were reporting that ammunition loads were down to 15%, and even lower in some cases. Discipline was starting to break down, as small units got into arguments about who the limited stocks of supplies were intended for. At the start of July, Kleist's war diary painted a grim picture of the supply situation. His quartermaster complained that in the case of bad weather, the supply convoys could not even move at reduced rates, and often consumed as much fuel as they delivered to the panzers. Deliveries by train were considered unsatisfactory at best. Another week of waiting had not improved the situation. Casualties were taking an enormous toll on the tactical efficiency of the units in Army Group South. Of the nearly 200,000 losses sustained up to the first week in August by the Wehrmacht, more than 63,000 had come from Rundstedt's forces. To replace this, OKH had dispatched only 10,000 men. A shortage of 50,000 men was an absurd handicap to an already overstretched army group. Halder had spent the first week of July crowing about the inevitable Soviet defeat and trumpeting the success of the Heer. Now, in the middle of August, he was singing a different tune. The overwhelming space of the Soviet Union, joined with its apparently endless reserves of political will and manpower, had crushed any hopes of an easy victory. On August 8th, Army Group South had advanced up to the Dnieper River south of Kyiv. However, the southwestern front managed to break through the lines between Kleist's Panzer Group and the 4th Infantry Corps. The limited reserves of the army group caused some panic, as elements of the 26th Army managed to advance 60 kilometers to Boguslav. The situation became so desperate that construction battalions were being sent into the fray in an attempt to stem the tide. To the north of Kyiv, at Korsten, the Red Army was being forced to retreat, but they were not being surrounded and destroyed like their compatriots had at Uman. The 5th Army had done its job and delayed the advance. It was becoming clear that Army Group South did not have the resources to encircle Kyiv on its own. At the far southern flank of Army Group South, the advance was also slower than expected. The Red Army was stiffening its resistance. Contributing to the agonizing pace was the exhaustion of the men and the poor supplies. A soldier in the 11th Army wrote down his thoughts on the advance in his memoirs. Our lines of supply became more strained with each day's advance, and as our momentum slowed to a crawl, we continued to experience ever-increasing sporadic shelling. In this sector, we found ourselves facing an enemy who held superiority in heavy weapons, and our own artillery units were now compelled to ration ammunition because of our strained supply lines. The depth of our penetration into the Soviet Union began to take its toll. At Odesa, the Southern Front's 9th Independent Army was finally boxed in to the limits of the city. Several separate German battalions had been tasked alongside the 72nd Infantry Division to support the Romanian 4th Army in taking the city. The Romanians were poorly equipped for an urban assault, but this task fell to them regardless. The fighting for the city was vicious and devolved into a slugging match as artillery duels reigned. The assault became a siege, and this slowly turned into a meat grinder for both sides. The fighting for the city would eventually last 73 days and cost 90,000 Romanian soldiers. The Red Army would eventually count 60,000 casualties in the fighting for Odesa in 1941. The Stavka knew that it would only be a matter of time before Army Group North resumed offensive operations on the approaches to Leningrad. They hoped to catch the Germans off guard with another counteroffensive, aimed at the 16th Army under Colonel General Busch. Vatutin, riding the prestige from his attack at Soltsy, was given responsibility for the planning of this larger attack as well. He had essentially complete freedom and all the resources of the Northwestern Front. However, his first draft plan was rejected outright by Stalin and Shaposhnikov. It was far too ambitious for the tastes of the men at the helm. He was ordered to tone it down and given serious restrictions, including limits on how fast he could advance. These were probably wise, and were born out of a developing understanding of the tactics of the Wehrmacht. The Stavka had legitimate reason to fear an overreach by Vatutin that would get his forces encircled and then destroyed. Early in the war, the Stavka had been too ambitious. They had thrown away hundreds of thousands of men in oblivious assaults, with poor reconnaissance and little to no preparation. Now they were attempting to temper the aggressive nature of their commanders. This was an unalloyed good, considering the situation the Red Army found themselves in by the middle of August. They could mobilize replacements for the lost men, but the Soviet Union was running out of space. They had to start winning battles soon. Vatutin was the man for the job, and he thought he had put together a competent plan to win back some territory and begin the reversal of Army Group North's fortunes. Unfortunately for him, on the 10th of August, he was preempted by the start of the planned German offensive. The plan had been for the 48th Army to attack at Utygosh, west of Lake Yelna, with the 11th, 34th and 27th Armies south of the lake to attack on a broad front and recapture a line at Soltsy. They hoped to cut off the 10th Infantry Corps under General of Artillery Hansen and push the rest of the 16th Army back. This counter-offensive was to begin on August 12th. This resulted in a disjointed response, as some units were engaged in defensive fighting, while others were still preparing for the attack. Vatutin chose to ignore this and sent the rest of his armies forward as planned on the morning of the 12th. In the early hours, this looked prescient. As the 10th Infantry Corps had been driving northeast, they were pushing themselves deeper into the envisioned envelopment. The 34th Army managed to push to the Staraya-Russudino rail line in less than 2 days of fighting. This level of success was almost unexpected. It was a gain of over 40 kilometers, and it outpaced the other Red Army forces in the area. Within hours of reaching the rail line, the 34th Army managed to successfully cut off the 10th Infantry Corps. It appeared as if Vatutin had managed another Soltsy. This was true in more ways than one. As at Soltsy, Army Group North reacted with speed and efficiency upon learning that one of their elements had been mostly cut off. Lieb turned the 3rd Motorized and the SS Totenkopf divisions to the relief of the 10th Infantry Corps. Manstein was put in charge of this effort and given the resources of the 8th Air Corps. He was to begin his counterattack immediately, but it took some days to get redeployed from the Luga-Leningrad axis to the south of Lake Uman. Only in the 3rd week of August would he manage to get into position and save the 10th Infantry Corps. For now, they were essentially on their own. They were well equipped and managed to fend off the weakening attack from Vatutin's force. He found himself in the same position as at Soltsy. He had a large enemy unit cut off. He had numerical superiority and the initiative. However, the terrain of the countryside was indifferent to the allegiance of the armies traversing it. Mother Nature was as cruel to Soviet trucks and tanks as it was to German ones. The assault got literally bogged down in the swampy, roadless terrain. Communication was difficult, as Vatutin was unable to coordinate his forces properly. Command and control broke down at the small unit level, as it had consistently done since the earliest hours of the war. Late in the 1st week of August, Guderian had been relieved at Yelna. This was carried out by the 20th Infantry Corps. He took advantage of this relief to strike south across the Soj River on August 8th and push directly into the 13th Army under the new Soviet Central Front. Aiming to take Gomel and secure Army Group Center's flank north of the Pripyat marshes, Guderian knew this would be another chance to flex his independent command. Taking Gomel would put him in a better position to assist Army Group South when that time came. Within days, he had managed to push aside the 13th Army and was rolling up the right flank of the 21st Army. On the 12th of August, he was joined in this push for Gomel by Colonel General Weich's 2nd Army. Together, these forces worked to achieve small tactical encirclement battles and destroy the Soviet forces in their way. By the end of the week, the 13th Army was combat ineffective, having had half its units destroyed by Guderian and Weich's. The pair would continue their assault on Gomel throughout the week, but wouldn't reach it until later in August. The Stavka could see that the Central Front was in danger of being destroyed, and that the path to Kyiv through the north would be open if this happened. On August 14th, they attempted to rectify this. Deploying General Kryz's 3rd Army and Major General Petrov's 50th Army to this new front, they created the Bryansk Front under Lieutenant General Eremenko. He was to defend the approaches to Kyiv from the north and cover the line between the southwestern and western fronts. As Guderian and Weich's were traipsing through the Central Front's defences, Zhukov and Timoshenko were still hammering on the German positions around Yelna. Zhukov had spent the 1st week of August asking for and receiving enormous resources from the Stavka Reserve for his planned assault. The Red Army was still struggling to bring up modern equipment and well-organized units, but Zhukov was getting the best the Stavka could spare. As he built up his forces, he received 2 tank divisions, the 102nd and 105th. Together with 2 motorized divisions and an independent company of T-34s, he was able to put together a corps of about 300 tanks. Zhukov chose to attack from a single direction. Retrospectively, he has been criticized for the lack of ambition in this choice of plan. Some historians would have him carry out a more complex plan, perhaps a double pincer on the salient. However, these critics ignore the realities of Zhukov's situation. He did not have the numbers he would have probably preferred. Time was not on his side, as by now Timoshenko's offensive to the north was faltering, and it would not be long before the Germans would be able to reinforce the pocket. If he delayed too long, it was not beyond the possible that the Heer would be able to break out of the pocket with the luxury of time and choice of where to strike. Zhukov was as aware of the limitations of his command and control capabilities as any general on the Eastern Front, German or Soviet. He was by no means a master of maneuver, but he had proven himself capable. Surely he was aware of the shortcomings of the Red Army. Dealing with masses of raw recruits and some veterans sprinkled in among them, his army did not have many seasoned non-commissioned officers in its ranks. There were still many officers filling billets 2 or even 3 grades above their rank and experience. Still, this was the army he had to work with. He chose an imperfect plan full of compromises to fit the circumstances he found himself in. It was clear from the beginning that his attack on Yelna could not be a repeat of Khalkhin Gol. The situations were completely different, and Zhukov well knew it. On August 8th, he began his onslaught. A shock group had been formed around the 102nd Tank Division. This was designated to attack at the northern sector of the salient. Zhukov had skillfully aimed this strike at the juncture of the 15th Infantry Division and SS Division des Reich. However, the shortcomings of the tactical leadership, combined with the well-prepared positions of the Germans, meant that little progress was made. This initial attack was called off after just 2 days, but Zhukov was not giving up. He was determined to evict the Wehrmacht from his side of the Desna. To this end, he continued to organize and plan a much more extensive operation to retake Yelna. It was in his favor that Army Group Center had been forced to halt its offensive operations eastward, and Zhukov was going to take advantage of it for as long as possible. The first serious counterattack at Yelna presaged the battle that would rage there for the next several weeks. Even though the Heer was able to hold its lines, it paid dearly for it. The 2 divisions facing Zhukov's shock group lost 2,000 casualties in 2 days. The pace was relentless, and there would be no relief for the invaders. Next week, we will continue the week-by-week account of the entire war on the Eastern Front. From June of 1941 to May of 1945, we will track the war's progress. Stay tuned, and remember, this is just the beginning of the weekly Eastern Front of World War II series. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, and share this video. It helps immensely. We have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.